Welcome to Second Table, where we discuss spirituality, philosophy, and psychology. I'm your host, Winston Janis. All right, so we're back again with Peter Rollins. Thanks for coming on a second time. I'm really excited to continue our conversation from the first time. I think it was a really good conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad we can kind of follow up. I know afterwards you emailed me and said there were a few questions and thoughts that, like a few threads that we could pull from the last one. So I was more than happy to oblige. Let's do a part two.
Yeah.
Jump into some of that.
Absolutely. So just to recap, I think that might be helpful from the part one. I think, one of the main points one of the main themes, and we discussed, obviously, oneness versus the idea of contradiction, or the idea that there's a rupture in reality. And that's something I'd love to explore more with you. And one of the things, I think the main points you were making throughout was that, we went into the yin and yang symbol and how we have to be careful. I think we agree that things are interconnected, that you can't know self without other, etc. But that is not the same thing as saying that there are two opposing forces, two substantial forces that need to be brought into balance, that we need to somehow achieve that. That it can be a kind of a dangerous sort of thinking. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that's kind of like, that's the, not that it's the right position, but that's the position that I'm taking. And I follow, very closely kind of Hegel's thought, which is kind of an extrapolation of that idea. So yeah, that's well said. Yeah.
I mean, there's so many places and directions I feel like we can go from that, and so many things we could discuss. But like last time, you mentioned to give an example of this, right? Like Mein Kampf, and how Hitler's talking about returning to this organic whole. You mentioned also Jordan Peterson returning to balance, and that there's always some sort of virus or external force that's threatening to disturb the balance. Now, it's interesting because I feel like that, in a way, it can be seen as contrary to oneness thinking, because if they understood that it's all one, right, they would understand that includes the virus, that includes the external force that seems to disturb the balance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, from Hegel's position, kind of just simplified to kind of a mythological level for the sake of this, is the one, in order to understand itself, in order to come to know itself, has to alienate itself from itself and then return to itself. And so there's this movement of alienation and return. And the ultimate unification of reality is the unification of unity and difference. But that model, which we can kind of which we were delving into, and I'd like to get even deeper into this time, that model, it's funny because it's kind of the opposite of a substantive reality. I mean, if you, again, to kind of put it in mythological form for a second, it's almost like saying that there's a rupture in reality, which we've talked about, and that rupture makes the one what it is. So the one only exists because of the rupture that prevents it from being one. In psychoanalytic terms, this means that, there's actually an interesting notion in psychoanalytic theory about the masculine and the feminine, which, by the way, has nothing to do with men or women. It's a very logical structure, but that the feminine is non-existent, and the feminine in its non-existence causes the masculine to exist. So the feminine is the mother of the masculine. It's a very weird thing, but actually you actually see it play out in everyday life, in that they will say men believe they're men and women pretend to be women. So that idea that a lot of women in the feminine structure can think about who will they be today, where a man says, what shall I wear today? But that the masculine is only held together by the feminine, which is, so what that ultimately means is, weirdly, it's creation ex nihilo. It's how reality arises out of two nothings. So I even put it in psychoanalytic terms. Consciousness doesn't exist either, any more than unconsciousness. The unconscious is the rupture in the subject that produces consciousness. So consciousness is a type of gap. And I know we're already getting kind of like into kind of a quite deep waters, but
just light trivial stuff,
just light.
Yeah, just like last time, light stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Casual 100%. Conversation,
But the way that this pans out, I'll say a couple of things about it and then fire back to you. So a couple of ways that it pans out is this notion that, say for example, in the political realm, some people think of, right, capitalism within Marxist theory. Capitalism has an inherent contradiction, right? So every mode of production has an inherent contradiction. So feudalism, we go back to before that actually. Let's go back to, there's tribalism. That has contradictions that leads to, then there's what Marx calls the Asiatic mode of production. Then there's the ones that we're more aware of, the feudal mode of production, which creates contradictions. I'm sorry, I missed out the slave mode of production. Sorry, the slave mode of production.
Yeah, can't forget
which
that.
Leads, which is kind of like in the slave mode of production, there's master and slave, and it's just power, and inequality is like right there in your face. And then in the feudal mode of production arises because that collapses in contradiction, right? All of that war and conflict. But in the feudal structure, there is still oppression, but now the oppression is held ideologically, lord and peasant and all of that. And that eventually gives rise to contradictions that lead to the next mode of production, capitalism. And capitalism, then the inequality is in the actual economic system itself. So we're all equal, but obviously in the economic system we're not, right? But the notion is then the next mode of production, eventually two more modes of production, and you get to a society without contradiction. And that is what Hegel warns us against. That is that there's somehow a non-antagonistic, non-contradictory future. And a good example of why this is a danger is, I'll give you two examples, one from Slavoj Žižek and one from Todd McGowan. Now, Slavoj Žižek says, right, let's imagine a mode of production in which there is a genuine equality. We're not alienated from our work. There's democracy in the workplace. We all share in what we produce. And, we also, let's imagine a society where we've also automated a lot of the worst jobs. Well, that doesn't get rid of contradiction. What Žižek talks about is we hit a really nasty contradiction, which is, so now you want to write the book you've always written, and you can, because you've got all the free time you want, so you can write that book. But what if it's crap and it doesn't sell? Now, at the moment, you can blame your work, right? You can blame capitalism, you can blame all of these things. But in that society, you can't blame anyone. You have to go, I'm just not a very good writer. So that raises a much more existential, Hegel would say, a much more intractable contradiction that has to be then overcome. And then Todd McGowan has a great example that he contrasts with a guy called Frederick Jameson, who says basically in the future, if we get beyond capitalism, we can imagine even death will not be something that we suffer from, because we believe in the good of society that will continue on after we're dead. But Todd McGowan says, no, it's the opposite. It's whenever life is tough, death can actually be something you can look forward to. If you ever have the flu and you go like, if I died now, it'd be great, right? But whereas if you're having a really good time, you're out with your friends and you're drinking, you're having a laugh, you might suddenly go, I hope I don't die right now because I'm having a blast, right? So imagine a society where you don't have so much of the alienation of work. Is the existential dimension of death might be much more pressing. And then that contradiction has to be engaged with. And all of this to say that In this Hegelian approach, it's not about balance of two substantive forces. It's about this perceptual imbalance that drives us to overcome the contradictions of the present moment, but which just brings us to even deeper contradictions. And salvation is at the point when we can embrace the contradiction itself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Because, okay, so you're saying in a way that there's almost, when you started talking out, it almost sounded like an evolution, right? You go from the feudal system and the slave system, and it kind of goes on. Yeah. But then it results in a system that you would think is ideal, but actually might be the most horrendous.
Yes. Right? I mean, this is Zizek says it amazing. Zizek says communist because he's a Marxist, and so is Todd McGann. But and like critical, both are critical Marxists. I'm a critical Marxist as well. But Zizek says it'll be worse. But when he says it'll be worse, that's his typical very provocative way of speaking. Because in a way, he's saying it's going to be a better worse. so when he says it's the worst, that's very dialectical because he says it's going to be even worse. But it's going to be worse because we're going to be even more in touch with an existential deadlock that is to some extent mitigated by the horrible deadlocks of alienation that we experience today.
Which, who knows, we might actually face at some point, right? With technology improving. I mean, there's people who want to eliminate death, which would seem on the surface like a good thing. But I feel like you're sort of the representative of Hegel in a way, and I'm like the Watts representative, right? And but he talked about a similar thing, how really Watts did say about how if we never died, that would also it would be a horrible thing because can you imagine just going on and on forever? If you really think that through, you'd go out of your mind,
And here's the trick, because I agree with Alan Watts in that, but I do think that Hegel has an even more perceptive analysis of that, because basically what Hegel would say is even if you abolish death is constantly occurring. In other words, you can think of it in a very esoteric way, like the death of the who I was a moment ago. I mean, in a way, I'm not who I was when I was a child, right? I'm changing. Right. So
it's almost not even esoteric. It's almost very concrete.
It's very concrete. Absolutely. It's kind of that's a brilliant. Thank you for saying that, because it sounds so abstract, but actually, it's the most concrete thing of all. Is that because I actually do think that if we are not destroyed in the next 1,000 years, I would well imagine that we can't, broadly speaking, push back death. I mean, I think we could, hypothetically, I don't think there's anything logically incoherent about the idea that we could push back death until the entropic end of the universe, right? Hypothetically, it's well beyond our lifetimes. We're not going to participate in that. But the notion is, even with that just raises a more intractable contradiction, which is that the catastrophe of death is actually already always happening. Something that the existentialists really understood is that death is not just waiting for us at the end of life, but death in the terms of, because death is a type of nothingness. So nothingness isn't just at the end of existence, but nothingness is within existence. And one of the names for that is guilt, where I am not the type of person I would like to be. So there's a type of, nothingness which is encountered in the experience of guilt. So there's a number of those nothingnesses that we feel. So what you start to see, I think you start to glimpse, is, so life is like a series of what can be called tarrying with the negative. And I think that's a term Hegel used, but Zizek wrote a book called Tarrying with the Negative, that actually that is the ultimate salvation, is to tarry eternally with the eternal negation. And
what do you mean by tarry?
To tarry is to kind of to wrestle with, to to not overcome, basically, to not try to flee from and to not try to overcome, but to, like, was it Jacob fighting God? To tarry with God, to wrestle with God, and then you get the blessing. You get the blessing from the ongoing wrestling. Yeah. And that's why actually Todd McGowan critiques Marxism in his book Emancipation After Hegel. His critique of Marx is simply that he thinks that there are elements of Marx where he thinks that the contradiction can eventually be overcome. And that's what he calls the right-wing deviation of the left. I think actually this is the right-wing deviation of progressivism. It's the right-wing deviation of woke culture, is a kind of fantasy of a non-antagonistic reality that's possible.
Yeah, that's fascinating to think about. Yeah, I mean, right. I definitely think that the left is guilty of that too. I definitely agree with you, seeing that purity culture and having to have everything be politically correct, which is a big complaint with folks who are conservative and on the right, that they don't want to tolerate that. And of course they have their own purity culture too. So gosh, we're always in a little bit of a mess, you know?
Yes.
Yeah. But
I mean, I think the true left position, like the kind of, and I'm talking more about the intellectual left, is not overcoming contradiction. I think that's kind of like the true, and that's why I don't think the left really has much power at the moment in America, because I don't think that position has much power, with a couple of notable exceptions.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a couple of directions. I mean, because on the one side, I mean, when we're talking about oneness and versus separateness, and I mean, it goes back to like, it seems like when we feel like, why is oneness such an popular concept? Why do we see? I mean, I can only talk really from my own personal experience, right? I think historically we've emphasized separateness in so many ways. I mean, in Christian tradition, God is viewed usually as separate and very different from ourselves. But I think,
mind you, God is the one, and the separateness can be overcome by Christ. So, for me, Orthodox Christianity is a oneness. No, I think the one exception, like one of the real high points of the Christian tradition, is Lutheranism and Calvinism, because they tried to think the gap, but I don't think they thought that. I think even they don't go far enough. So I'm very unpopular in this way, because that's typical progressive position. It says Christianity is about ontological separateness, and that's a bad thing. For me, that's the genius of Christianity, is it understood the original sin, original lack, but Orthodox Christianity pulled back from that, and then basically has a God that is one and whole, and then the idea that we can be reconciled to the one. But I know what you're saying, which is a lot of Christianity, the separateness is something that we have to endure in the present moment. But I think it's to endure to overcome. That's the difference. For Lacan, it's not something to endure to overcome, or for Zizek, it's something to celebrate. It's actually the driving force of reality itself. But anyway, I'm much more pro the lack than progressives, obviously.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm just thinking about how when people feel separate, and you know, they that all of a sudden there comes a fear thing where if you feel separate, you feel vulnerable, and you also start thinking, if there's people outside of you, well, then I can kill the outsiders, right? Who are separate from the in group. And so I see that as a kind of related to the scapegoating mechanism, right?
Yes, but the universalism of Paul is the universalism that we are all outside, that the one thing we share is that we're all what he calls the trash of the world, but we're all outsiders. So there's two standard universalisms in religion. There's the conservative universalism, which is the messages for everybody, but only some people get in. So that's, conservative fundamentalist universalism. And we all know that Christian universalism.
Right.
And that's different from particularism of, say, Judaism, where you actually don't need to become Jewish, right? So it's or Islam's a particularistic religion. So Christianity's always been universalist. But the way the conservatives understand that universalism is to say the message is for everybody, to all ends of the earth. And then for generally the progressive, it's that the power of the message is effective for everybody. So everybody gets in. Everybody is ultimately on the inside. Everybody gets to the table. But for someone like Alain Badiou, the French philosopher who took an interest in Paul, he says that the true genius of Paul is he doesn't want to get everybody to the table. He wants to overturn the table. Is that what unifies us is the universal outside. So we identify with Christ, who is the one who gave up their identity. So to say that you identify with Christ means that you lose your Jew, Gentile, slave free, male, female identity, but you don't take on a new identity. You identify with the loss of identity. And, Marx calls this the proletariat, and in Christianity it's called the church, but it's the community of the outside. So what I'm saying is that type of separateness, you're absolutely right, doesn't push it far enough, because I'm separate from you. Therefore, either you're whole, which is Orientalism, like you're something special, more true to nature, whatever, or I am more substantial, my community. And that's kind of racism, et cetera, et cetera. But in this position, it's like, no, what we all share in common is, in a sense, our shared inability to be human. We all share the fact that we are not who we are, that we are not at one with ourselves. And that is what I would call the community of believers, the community of the neither nor. So I know I'm pushing back on you a lot here, but we're just having a good conversation.
Absolutely. No, it's fine. Yeah, I mean, that's another area that I wanted to talk about was, so we're getting into the idea of following Christ as the one who gave up identity, or Paul saying we're giving up all identity. And one of the things that I was curious to get deeper into in this podcast was the idea of talking about nothingness and exploring that, because what is the crack, what is the rupture, but nothingness. And you said, at one point in the last recording, like, you shouldn't positivize a negative, and that Jung was making the negative into something substantive. And I just wanted to hear you elaborate more on that.
That's right. You said in the email, I talked about it being criminal. It's very strong language, too strong.
That's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the reason, but why I was so strong in that is, now there is a certain sense in which I want to mark the negative, and a good example of this is the number 0. Right, 0 is a circle around a void. That's all 0 is, right? And that was a real innovation within mathematics. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever. I mean, the first time 0 comes in, that's a very abstract concept. So now if you write 0 to 9 on a piece of paper, you've got 10 numbers, right? Because 0 is a number, you can count 0. And so 0 is not a positivizing of the void, but it's a marking of the void. And it's a marking of the void that allows for the innovations within mathematics. Eventually we get to negative numbers, imaginary numbers, et cetera, et cetera. So in the same way, I go like, yes, when you talk about the unconscious, you're marking a type of gap. Or when you talk about evolution, you're marking a type of gap. And that mark allows you to predict behavior, to understand behavior, and also to change behavior, right? That's the whole point in analysis, is that understanding and marking the lack allows for, it has predictive power and it has transformative power. So the reason why I contrasted Jung and Freud in the last episode is because Jung substantiates both consciousness and unconsciousness, makes them both a thing. And but for Freud, the unconscious is not a thing. Not only is it not a thing, it's a non-thing that actually generates the illusion of consciousness, which is because all consciousness is a not at oneness with itself. Consciousness is, in a sense, that for Hegel, consciousness is just the gap between subject and object. Right? There's the sense of that there is something between subject and object. That's consciousness. And then self-consciousness is just consciousness of consciousness. Self-consciousness is just where you make consciousness into an object of itself. Now that's heavy stuff maybe, but that's the difference between the two. And I'm trying to argue that when you substantivize the kind of like light and dark,
is it dualism?
It's a type of dualism, and even though some people will say, well, you blended the dualism by a type of balance. Yes, you're right, but it's a dualism, and the problem is it doesn't realize that I think Hegel is right here, that balance is just it's a fantasy. It is now, you asked the question earlier, it's a very good question of why are we so susceptible to that fantasy? And there's reasons, of course, because we want that oceanic experience of oneness. Our individuality can be hard to bear, but it's a very important question. Yeah. We probably won't get to in this podcast, but the question of why are we so susceptible to oneness? But putting that to one side for a second.
Because we fear nothingness would be one thing, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Because nothingness is death.
Yeah. And we fear, although the funny thing is, You're absolutely right. We fear that, but sometimes what we fear most is the in between. As I say, whenever you're not feeling well, sometimes you just want to die. Right? Death is a kind of like a return to the void. It's kind of the ultimate mystic experience, right? Instead of an oceanic experience for a few minutes, or take MDA or something, and you experience it for 8 hours. Why not just kill yourself and return to the void? You get ultimate homeostasis. For less than the cost of a holiday. But the true difficulty to bear is to bear the becoming that we are creatures between being and nothingness. That is it's not difficult to bear most of the time and all of that, but ultimately it is hard to bear. Yeah. Our tarrying with the negative is tough, but it's much better than the alternative, I would say.
The alternative being what exactly?
So being either that you put the negative onto another, so you get them to carry it, or you fully fall into it entirely yourself and can't bear it. So basically, if you can't carry the negation within you, you're going to scapegoat. You're going to find someone else to carry it. Or it's going to erupt in negative ways in your life. You're going to repress it, and then it's going to explode. So either you're going to be very unhappy, or you're going to make somebody else very unhappy, and neither of those are nice things.
Yeah. I mean, one thing you said was that to identify with Christ is to identify with the negative, and that goes back to the surrendering identity.
The idea of kenosis, which I think we mentioned at least briefly, is this idea of kenosis, which is the becoming nothing of God, which is a very interesting theological concept in Christianity.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I do think, right, like, so Watts talked about, I think you're right when you say that there's this, the rupture, the negative, the nothingness that is inherent in reality. So, for instance, when because Watts's whole thing is a oneness thing. It's being one with the universe and all that kind of stuff. But he talks about how, right, in order to have self-consciousness, there needs to be a kind of a separation. So why is it that there's an extent to which the universe doesn't understand itself, or we can't fully understand, we can't grasp ourselves, the world, or God? Why? Well, like you this kind of connects with what you were talking about. A rock doesn't have self-consciousness. It's at one with itself. right? So Watts says,
Yes. Although whenever I mentioned that, I kind of had a little caveat, which is actually I don't think a rock is at one with itself, but at a very, very basic level, there's movement of atoms and there's like division within it. And it's weird because basically a rock is there's a very primordial kind of like very, very basic not at oneness within the rock that will take billions of years to kind of become us. But I would say that even the rock is not at one with itself at a very microscopic, not even microscopic, at an atom, even actually at a quantum level. Basically, at a quantum level, even the rock is not at one. But anyway, keep going because it works for everyday language.
Well, right, because what I'm trying to start to get into is talking about consciousness, and and so that would make sense, right? I wouldn't be able to probably talk about it in an intelligent way, but I remember coming across some sort of article, scientific article, about how consciousness, people who research consciousness are starting to get into this really weird mystical place where they're seeing that there is a rudimentary kind of consciousness, and it sounds very woo-woo, right? But I mean, these were real scientists and philosophers kind of saying, okay, there seems like the way we've been going about trying to understand consciousness is all wrong, but and that things have a sort of a rudimentary sort of consciousness to them.
From a Hegel perspective, that makes sense. Now, but for Hegel, who's like the opposite of woo-woo, he's just such a boring philosopher. But he wouldn't say that rocks have consciousness, but he would say that consciousness comes about at a certain point in the universe when the not at oneness of reality deepens its contradiction. So when being comes out of nothingness, life comes out of being, consciousness comes out of life, self-consciousness out of consciousness, understanding or rationality out of self-consciousness, right? These are these moments. And so in a weird, very, very interesting way, is consciousness is simply that not at oneness of itself that is in reality, but brought to such a high degree. But ultimately, all consciousness is, as I mentioned, is the gap between subject and object, and then all self-consciousness is consciousness of consciousness. So it's the experience of the lack that is within the subject itself.
Right, like Watts would say, a knife cannot cut itself, fire cannot burn itself, teeth can't bite themselves. In other words, right. That's what it looks like to be totally at one. Right. So in the same way, really for Watts, I think what he's connecting it back to is the only way that God can have an experience at all, really, or we can have an experience at all, is through this differentiation and through the gap, really, of right, because if a knife is at one with itself, it can't cut itself. So there has to be some sort of gap. I think for Watts, it is probably more a sense that this is an illusion, which we talked about a little bit. We got into that's one way of perceiving oneness, is that the duality is an illusion. And that's probably what I would lean more towards. But then you've got an
incredibly difficult question then. I mean, philosophy is full of incredibly difficult questions, but I've never heard a Buddhist give a good answer to this, is why have we fallen into the veil of illusions? If this is an illusion, then, and all I've heard Buddhists say is basically, well, we're in it, right? That's not a question that we can ask or we can address. The fact is we're just in it. But as a philosopher, that's never obviously a satisfying answer. The question is, well, how did we fall? Whereas for Hegel, the rupture is actually, think about is it called the Higgs field? Yeah. Whereas the idea in quantum mechanics that there is a type of energy within a vacuum itself. So there is basically a disturbance within nothingness itself that is central. So anyway, that's a question. I don't know if you can answer it or give me even. But it's why have we fallen into a veil of illusions?
Actually, yes. So I think so. Right. So Watts was very fascinated with pretty much all Eastern thought, right? Not only Buddhism and Zen, but Taoism and Hinduism and Hindu mythology. So in Hindu mythology, there's this idea of the world as a drama. So there's the self, right, which you can equate with God, Brahman. And Brahman wants the illusion on some level, right? It's actually something that is desired, self-forgetting, which connects with kenosis.
But you said, like, until you have the separation, you can't have some sort of absolute that's conscious of itself. So you can't have if you priest, or even in mythology, if you have a god who desires something within this idea, is that they already have to be divided. And keep going anyway. But you're saying, that God kind of wants to experience this drama. The only difference I'm saying is then that goes against the notion that the rupture is required for the absolute to know itself. Because then before the rupture, there is no absolute that can know itself. There is no pre-rupture. You could say there's an amorphous substance, kind of, in a kind of But we're getting into bizarre philosophy here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I fully understand what you're saying, but I mean, I think I wouldn't necessarily take all this literally, right? We're getting into sort of mythological language, religion language that I don't think is necessarily meant to be taken literally, right?
Well, we are, but I'm first and foremost a philosopher. So although I like the mythological language, so the mythological language of like kenosis and stuff, ultimately, for me, it has to be philosophically sound.
Okay.
So for example, in the illusion, because I've heard this before, that the idea of God desiring to know, either desiring for others to be in the world of play, or desiring to know itself. That's an interesting, but that mythology, I think that's a oneness mythology, and I don't think it can be philosophically cashed out. That's my question. I don't think it can be philosophically made into currency.
Well, I mean, I don't know, maybe just to pan it out just a little bit more, because I definitely would like to understand why, the reasons for why you think it doesn't cash out, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, because maybe, I mean, I don't know how popular this idea is. Obviously, we know that Watts has some popularity, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But the world as a drama. So in this sort of mythology, God wants. So he uses a few analogies. One of the ways he talks about this is, he's asking really the question, what would you do if you were God, right? And he says, imagine that every night you had the power to dream whatever dream you wanted to dream. 75 years time, right? And at the end of it, you always wake up. And he says, so in the beginning, you'll give yourself all of these pleasures, right? You'll have sex with all, women, and there'll be palaces and gorgeous and all kinds of food, and no problems, no contradiction, right? No antagonism whatsoever. But after a while of that, it's going to become boring, or you get tired of it, right? And then you'll introduce a small element of danger. You got to save a princess from a dragon, or go on some sort of adventure. And this gets into the idea that drama, all storytelling has conflict within it, right? Which is an interesting thing to think about in itself, that we really don't tell stories that don't have antagonism in them. But as it progresses, he basically is arguing that you would get to the point where you would want to actually forget that you were even the way to really be immersed in the dream, to make it more and more real, would be to totally forget that you're dreaming in the first place, and then it would be within the possible realm of dreams that you could have that you would be dreaming this exact moment, this exact life that you're in.
See, okay, okay. I'll give you two reasons why I'm really nervous about that position. One, I think really makes me very nervous, is in that view, this is all just a cosmic game. And so everything's, and we can push it to extremes and say the Holocaust is just a cosmic game played by God, and what God wants to do in order to fully enjoy the game is forget that it's in the game, or help us forget it's in the game. And I think that's a horrific worldview, because it basically says that, yeah, God's bored. God's just bored and wants to play a game. And we're all part of this cosmic game that has no meaning, no significance, bar a bit of danger for God. Secondly, the logical reason why I disagree with it, so that's the moral reason. The logical reason is because if consciousness is gap and self-consciousness is a gap within the gap, then you were already starting with God having a gap within God, because if God's thinking, if God's dreaming, even mythologically, that idea only makes sense with gap. And I contrast that with Hegel's notion of reality, is that we are part of the universe coming to know itself. We are the universe coming to see itself, to know itself, to be itself. And therefore we are participating in this grand, not a drama, not a play. We are participating in a small drop in the universe coming to know itself over billions of years. Now, so a secular religion, and there's a guy called Ilyenkov, who's a Russian Soviet philosopher, who did this incredible cosmological philosophy. But he kind of created a secular religion. And a secular religion in a nutshell is this. You'll like this. You maybe heard me talk about this. He said he worked with some biologists and some cosmologists, and they were talking about how the universe will die of a heat death, right? Die of entropy. And the only way that this won't happen is if somehow entropy can be reversed, basically what they call a big crunch. But a big crunch doesn't make mathematical sense. Can't figure out, why a big crunch would happen. And so Ilyenkov postulated a speculative system in which the universe, over time, creates a being that can create a technology that can reverse the entropy of the universe. And so he calls these people the ultimate communists, right? Because only an ultimate communist, like a cosmic communist, is that the most intelligent beings that are created by the universe, their job is to sacrifice themselves and everything, reverse the very direction of the universe, crunch it into a big crunch, and then it'll hit a big bang again. But what I love about this is there's a dignity to it. The dignity is not that this is a game of a bored God, but actually we are the universe playing itself out, and that we have this central role, and now we're just playing a minor part in the central role, not only of the universe getting to know itself in Hegel, but if you go with Ilyenkov, and I think there's reasons to see a system as speculative, whatever, but if you go with it, is that the ultimate role of the individual is to destroy the entire universe, and that's a great thing. So do you see, like I'm saying, like that Watts notion of a play, of a drama, makes me feel a bit icky. And then secondly, it also, I think, presupposes the rupture, which is the Hegelian point. What do you think?
Well, first of all, you kind of ended that note at saying it was sort of an honorable thing to destroy the universe. Is that right? So, I mean, I know that it sounds bad, right? When, it's all just a drama of a bored God, but destroying the universe sounds pretty bad too. But. Yes,
but for Ilyenkov, it's at the point of entropy. So in this hypothetical system, is the universe will eventually get to the point in which, as you know, with entropy, is all matter is distributed basically equally. Just at this point where everything's dead anyway, these hyper intelligent beings who are probably pure energy at that point can reverse it all so that they start the universe again, so that all life is recreated. And so we kind of have this, life has this ultimate sacred dimension, which is to eventually start the whole process again. So but okay. That's Ilyenkov, but that was me more being playful. But just taking the Hegel point, is that for Hegel, it's like we are playing this part in the universe coming to it, basically truth. I mean, Hegel calls it absolute knowledge. Is we are this kind of the universe coming to know its truth. or inventing truth, or however you want to say it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the questions that comes up for me is like, to what end, right? Because when Watts is kind of putting this forth, and I could see how, right, I mean, it's not perfect, it's problematic or whatever, and not necessarily, I think, to be taken literally. I think even Watts would have said that, this is Hindu mythology, and not necessarily, it's, but it's like, he would say, if you're gonna play the game of life, which of course he's saying using that language of it being a game, but you got to have an optimal theory. Otherwise, why not just commit suicide, right? So we have to ask ourselves, this gets back to the basic philosophical question, which is, what's the point of any of this? And I think, for Watts, it was kind of like, why does a child play? Well, a child doesn't play for any secondary purpose. We adults, we like to say, well, I'm going to relax and go on vacation and exercise because it's good for me, right? Because it's going to make me more productive at my job, right? Versus a child who's just saying, well, I just play to play. There is no secondary purpose that they're at least consciously thinking about. It's enjoyed in and of itself. And so, right, I think there's some scriptures which I wouldn't be able to name verbatim, but just where God is talking about it's just for the sake of the glory of God, which, he's trying to tie that into the same idea that that what is the ultimate purpose of the universe? Well, it exists for its own sake, that this is a kind of a dance, a kind of a glorious firework display is another way to put it.
Now, but the issue is now, and one might not go with this. In fact, it's quite a controversial view in some ways. But I like what Hegel talks about when he talks about mythology, because he basically, religion is his last stage before absolute knowledge, and he looks at the various religions in the world and all of that, and he thinks that mythology is a way of understanding the universe. And for him, like a good mythology, and he talks about like there are certain mythologies that can help us understand the nature of the universe. But then he says, but they have to be, the next level is basically you can render them into knowledge. And rendering them into knowledge is the point at which you can render them into something philosophical. And so my thing is, yes, my goodness, what I do is similar. It's like I'm very into radical theology, because I think it is a story that kind of captures the depth of Hegelian philosophy, but without having to study Hegel. But it does cash out. Now it sounds like, and a lot of people do this in kind of our world, but they think that you can't get above mythology. So mythology is the highest level. So you can't kind of, so what you've got is you've got various mythologies, and you kind of pick the one that sounds the nicest or whatever, but you can't really penetrate beyond mythology. But I would argue that you can. And I'd argue that you can kind of like, we can push these mythologies and kind of like, some are better than others. And that mythology you're talking about, I don't know. I don't even agree with the game side of things, but I don't want to because I kind of think that the beautiful thing about game playing for kids is that yes, there is an enjoyment inherently in the practice, but I think that what game playing is partly about working out how we fit into the world. So there is a very beautiful immanent nature to play, but I think but it sounds almost Orientalist, like kids have this kind of special, closer to nature, closer to immanent being than adults. When we all know, Charlie Chaplin knew this best, is that the only people who know that kids are assholes were other kids, right? Anyone who's a kid knows when they're in primary school how terrible kids are. The only people who don't know that kids are terrible are adults, because we kind of we orientalize them. but being a kid, oh my God, if you can remember back to being in school, is full of horrors and fear. And
I don't have to. I mean, my own boys, I have two boys, and they fight all the time. They just want to kill each other, So yeah.
Yeah, you see it. It's funny how we don't see it, but even when we do, you're very perceptive there. Because I saw two kids today at the downstairs, and one of them was punching the other, and I was like, he was just so weak that he couldn't really do much. But I was like, if that kid had Mike Tyson's strength, I think the kid would just beat that other kid to death. Like, thank goodness he's so weak.
I could see that. I could see that. Yeah.
But I feel bad because actually I think this conversation is very, very good. And I like the play between that we're doing, the dance between Watts and Hegel. And, I think this is a productive dance that we're doing. So I hope that you feel the same way,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So anyway, yeah.
Why do you feel bad?
Well, because I'm so there's certain elements of this type of spirituality that I'm kind of like pushing back on, that I'm nervous about in terms of how it cashes out, and that's why I keep pushing back, and I don't kind of just agree, just go, oh yeah, that's nice. Like,
no, absolutely. I mean,
yeah, but the question is, what is, like, it could sound like I'm coming from a weirdly anti-spiritual dimension, but there is a weirdly, because I connect this with Christianity, obviously. So the position that I'm exploring, I kind of think that has an inherent connection with a non-confessional reading of Christianity. Mm-hmm. And so, that in and of itself might be quite interesting to explore.
Well, I mean, okay, yeah, we could explore a little bit of that.
Yeah. Or is there something else in your mind?
Well, I just, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's my own just trying to push back a little bit on
that.
The idea of the world as drama maybe is not so bad. I don't think it's hard to find any position that maybe is ideal or not problematic, but I guess I do think that's in some ways central to who we are as humans, right? I mean, we are storytellers, and that's in some ways how I make sense of it. I think it's always dangerous to try to give an answer, or I don't think we can ultimately give an answer for suffering, but I know that for me personally, one of the ways I've tried to make sense of suffering, right, is that it's like you see I've never read a novel or watched a movie in which there wasn't some sort of problem. It's like Joseph Campbell maybe in The Hero's Journey, right?
Yes, but he's the yin yang guy. So he's a Jungian guy as well. So yeah, but anyway, he's very well liked.
Yeah,
so, yeah.
And Watts liked Jung as well. I don't think he was ever his patient, but they had conversations together and that kind of thing that I'm aware of. But yeah. So I don't know. I found it a fascinating idea that once again, just the idea of the universe as play. I think you're right when you see the worst parts of it.
But by the way, not even the Holocaust. I mean, the fact that there's oil is evidence of the death of like an unfathomable amount of creatures. Even C.S. Lewis got this, actually. He always said, the argument for designs had never worked for me, because he said, like, if you take the universe, most of it seems dead, like completely dead and inhospitable to anything, any of the universe that we can see. So it seems like 99.999% of the universe is just dead nothingness. And then he says, even if you just take our little planet, 99% of human history has been utter hell. And we've now got to a place where even today, life is hell for a huge amount of people. And we've kind of got to a point today where a small percentage of us, for a very small period of time, can have a reasonably nice time. And so... And that's not a mythology that I've just told you. I mean, that's kind of just true, And so when you put a mythology of, the god was bored and wanted to play, you're like, But with Hegel, I think he has.
Although to clarify, this god does enter into it's not God is not watching this experience from distance, right? God is actually participating in it and actually going through it as well, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, not that I don't know if that makes it any better, but you know,
it's also very like it's profoundly nihilistic. I think in that like God's bored, and then God decides. And I can understand the logic. It is like the hero's journey, because God goes like, right, I'm bored, so let's play a game. And then hold on, you can't really enjoy the game when you know it's just a game, because you also know there's absolutely no point to it. So now I'm going to give myself amnesia so that I can pretend that the game's important. It's like, whoa. So like we're participating in a game that is utterly meaningless, and the only way to avoid the sheer the divine melancholy is to have divine amnesia, so that we can think that this game is important and interesting, when it just causes suffering, is ultimately pointless. But for Hegel, it's not. For Hegel, the unfolding of the universe is the discovery and the participation in truth. And that for Hegel is inherently kind of like a very impressive thing for us to be able to participate in. Yeah, so I'm being very harsh on Watts at this point, but that's kind of my worry.
Okay, so yeah, so you were saying Hegel, his big thing is understanding the truth.
Yeah,
is that right?
Yeah, kind of coming.
So say a little more about that.
Yeah, so again, just to kind of simplify it, Hegel kind of says that there's a moment in the universe where subject and object starts to exist. That's consciousness, right? So we can think of even snails or whatever. And so now there's within the world a kind of like split. And then self-consciousness is where consciousness itself becomes the object. So you become consciousness of your own conscious of your own consciousness, sorry. And what Hegel ultimately says is that what the universe is slowly doing is it's coming to know itself through us, or we are the universe coming to know itself. And weirdly, the ultimate...
That sounds so much like Watts. I know there's differences, but it just sounds so much like that. But go on.
Yeah, but in the coming to know itself, it's also, and this is where it sounds really weird at first, it's also coming to be itself. It's this coming to know itself is also where it becomes transparent to itself, is also what kind of brings it into being. And so the ultimate moment of Hegel, and like it says, his pinnacle, is when you briefly look behind the matrix, right? When you look at the world and you see all the lines, and you realize that you're in the lines and that you're in the matrix.
One. You're the one.
You're the one, but the funny thing is, and this is why it's different, is you're not the one, you are the gap. That's the trick. Is that always I keep coming back to. But we're and you reach out an olive branch there, I'll reach out an olive branch. You go, this is where maybe there is a similarity, is because I know the little bit I know of Alan Watts. I don't know much, but I have heard him once. I saw something where he talked about the this notion of the universe coming to know itself, et cetera, et cetera. Like this, but that mythology does not sit well with the mythology of the one is already substantive, already kind of like, even mythologically speaking, has a type of awareness of itself. Because for Hegel, that's not the case. The case is that it is the very, let's call it the reverberation of the lack is what kicks everything off. A type of less than nothing. And that very gradually, this kind of awareness arises in the universe. So yeah, so maybe there's some similarities there.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, I'm thinking, okay, if a God or the self is wanting to go on this adventure, that is a lack, right? Wanting to go on the...
Well, that's exactly what I mean. That's what I mean, is that the lack is already in that mythology. So whenever I'm saying it's not a good mythology, it's not, although I critiqued it morally, I also wanted to critique it philosophically, that as soon as you bring desire into the absolute, you've already presupposed lack. So therefore, you don't need to bring lack into the game. Lack already exists. So even in the mythology of God desiring, of God being bored, to be bored, you have to desire. To desire, you have to lack. So the lack is already in the absolute. I mean, we're talking mythologically here again. For your listeners, we kind of bounce a little bit between philosophy and mythology, which I want to do. I just want to kind of note that we're doing that. Go ahead.
Right, but wouldn't that necessarily... I mean, wouldn't that agree with you if the absolute has the lack already... the crack within it?
Well, yeah, but that's my issue with the mythology, is it doesn't go back far enough. It's trying to understand why there is this rupture within reality, and it says because God is bored, wants to make a drama, and I'm like, no, go further back. You don't need to do that. There's a lack. That mythology can only work if there's already a lack in reality itself, which then brings you back to Hegel, which means that. Because the West, and the little bit I know about that kind of westernized Hinduism or whatever is that the gods are playing out a drama, and the drama is the veil of illusion. This is what we're caught in, but then there's a substantial lack in the absolute that then generates this. So you see what I'm saying? It doesn't answer where does the veil of illusion come from, because it only answers it by saying there's a lack, an ontological lack in the absolute, and then there's a veil of illusion. Whereas a lot of people, I thought Alan Watts was saying this, is that there is just a veil of illusion. There is no ontological lack in God. There's not. All there is a veil of illusion. And if there is only a veil of illusion, then I don't see how anything started off. I don't see how it all kicked off. I don't see how the universe started. For me, quantum mechanics is kind of the physics of an oscillation in reality. And I hate, by the way, quantum mechanics used in spiritual ways. I'm talking about just purely the hardcore. I don't know much quantum mechanics, to be honest. I get my quantum mechanics mostly through some philosophers, but there's a guy, Cavell, who I've kind of watched quite closely, and he's a pure quantum mechanics guy. But he also likes philosophy, which I like. It's funny, by the way, this is very funny, because we had the first podcast, and then you emailed me and go like, I enjoyed that, but I think we need to clarify some things. And I think what we've simply done is gone more into the weeds. But I love that. That's my philosophy in a nutshell. is the desire to clarify. You just get to more intractable contradictions. I think
we're gonna clear up the problems, and now we've got 50 more.
Yeah, I know. See, now you're going to email me again, and we need a part 3, and part 3 will be so difficult to understand. So maybe that's a good cue for us to tie it back more strongly into the practical. So one of the questions I asked you in my email, right, was how do we understand then? Once again, I'm going to be a pastor in a church, right? And there's people who are still going to church. Hopefully people will be still going to church with this coronavirus thing going on. I don't know. Yeah. But, it's kind of crazy. I've got a festival coming up, and I think a lot of people are not buying tickets because they want to be safe, which I totally understand. But I'm like, we've sold enough to make it happen. But I was like, why are the tickets not going? I was like, oh yeah, it's the coronavirus. Yeah. Everyone's like, there's a bit of anxiety around.
Oh yeah.
Whereas I don't feel any anxiety, so I couldn't figure it out till somebody said to me. I was like, I don't know why this isn't selling. It always sells really well, and last year was so good. They were like, have you heard of the coronavirus? I was like, oh yeah.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. Right, exactly. But I don't know, it's a scary thing, but right, I think the question kind of goes back to, within the Christian tradition, love and compassion are so central, and are so central to so many different faiths. Yes, exactly. And what it means to be human.
I was going to say no. Yeah, they're not Christian. They're not Christian. They're human, right? That's compassion and love. As exactly. This is this is actually one of the insights of ecumenism. And I'm not ecumenical in the sense of I think religions all have these very different things to say, but yeah, love and compassion. I don't, unless you define love in a very specific way, which I think you can. Like, there's a type of love that you could say is invented within Christianity or whatever. But in general, yeah, I go like they're universals. Is there anything about Christianity that is an innovation? That's the question. And I think there is. We could talk about that. But anyway, because by the way, you're going into the ministry, and I want to convert you to the bad news of power theology. And that's what I'm going to try and do live on this podcast. I'm going to do just as I am.
Bring it on.
But the reason why I want to do that is because this is where it comes down to the story again, mythology, whatever. Is for me, the church is the place that enacts this embrace of the lack, and the church is more needed than ever, because we need a place where that can happen. And the way it happens is not that we sit around and read philosophy. The way it happens is we have liturgical practices that help us enter into that. And so I know so let's go that direction. One thing I want to say for your listeners is, we're not going to get too deep into this, obviously, but I do have resources that are freely available about how that looks. So we may talk about it briefly. If we don't get into it, it's out there. So anyway, let's kick into this. Christianity, the ministry.
Right. We're talking about a lot of abstract stuff, which I really enjoy. The crack in the universe, right?
Yeah.
I was joking with my wife. We were talking about, our conversation, excited about this new podcast and stuff. And she was leaving the house. I was like, watch out for the crack in the universe. She was leaving that. But right. So what does this look like? If at the heart of things, there is this void, this crack, this rupture, how does that, to put it one way, help me to love my neighbor or to become more Christ-like? How does it help to transform our relationship with ourselves and with our community? Whether we're Christian or not, right?
100%. Could I very briefly try to sum up the entire Bible in 3 minutes or less, right? Okay, I'll see if I can do this.
Go.
That connects with this and then gets into your question, right? Here's one way of reading the Bible, is that the Bible starts just like a child. There is an experience of lack from the absolute. You feel separate from the absolute. And one of the real innovations of the Jewish tradition is the idea that you're not supposed to fill this gap with graven ideology, right? Or idolatry, with images. That's the same as, because in psychoanalysis, fantasy is how we imagine closing the gap between ourselves and the other. So basically, fantasy is the various ways in which we think we can be one with our primary caregiver. But every time, whenever you fantasize, it's at its core. It's hard to find initially, but fantasy is what we try to do to stop the anxiety of separation. And the Jewish tradition says, don't do it. Don't fantasize. Don't close the gap between God, the absolute, and the community. Very, very intelligent. And that's why Jewish mysticism is so different from Christian mysticism. Jewish mysticism doesn't constantly talk about how you can't talk about God, right? In Christian mysticism, it's constantly talking about how you can't talk about God, writing about how you can't write about God. In Jewish mysticism, it's kind of more like you can't talk about God, and that's that, right? And it's much more earth. But
you're welcome to try, right?
And that's because of this basic prohibition, very interesting prohibition, right? But then the covenants, what are the covenants? People think covenants are there to make you close to the absolute. But actually, a covenant is designed to separate you, keep the separation. In other words, you set up a contract with a business partner to get away from their desire. Because if you set up a business with a business partner, or you get married, and the business partner or your marriage partner decides that they want something else, the contract kind of protects you, well, especially in a business contract. It's better in terms of a divorce contract, right? When you get divorced, The contract you set up is designed to protect you from the desire of the other person. So that if they decide they don't want to give you money or they don't want you to see the kids, you can say, doesn't matter what you desire, this is what we've decided. So the covenants are designed to separate you from the desire of the other, which again is to try to mitigate the anxiety of not knowing what the other desires. Then in Christianity, you have this really interesting thing. Obviously, God becomes human, the first kenosis. God empties God's self into being human. But then you have the second kenosis, where God experiences the self-emptying of God within God. And that's on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? This is the ripping of the temple curtain. And then the epoch of the Holy Ghost, where God is now the insubstantive interconnection between the community of people who love each other. Right? Well, God is where 2 or 3 are gathered together in love. God is not an object that you love, but God is the reality discovered in the act of love itself. That is, that would take me 3 weeks to unpack, but just in a nutshell, that's what I think the liturgy is designed to do. Is the innovation of Christianity is this notion that God experiences a lack within God. That is fascinating. That's why Hegel liked it so much. That's why he felt that it was the step before philosophy. Is he says, oh, this captures what Hegel said, oh, this captures exactly what I'm trying to say, which is there is a lack within the absolute. And when we identify with the absolute and then experience that lack, we are then freed from the frenetic pursuit of wholeness and completeness, which creates scapegoating mechanisms and therefore creates all these human evils. And so the community of believers is the community that can embrace their lack and therefore are freed from all of these evils that come from the scapegoating mechanism. And so, as I say, in politics it's called the proletariat, Christianity is called the church, but it's the community, the trash of the earth. Luther calls us the shit of the world. Christians are literally the shit of the world, right? The trash of the world. We experience our own outsidedness, and the point is that frees us from both the horror and the sadness of pursuing something that will make us complete, and also the violence that comes from that pursuit. That's why the church is necessary.
Yeah, I love it, and although I can hear maybe certain people listening and still having trouble with, I guess, this the idea of God having a lack of being incomplete. I think of the evangelical community or fundamentalist community who, for them, God has to be the it, right? The thing that they can achieve that's going to make them whole and going to provide for them and protect them.
Except that within conservatism, there is a real strong belief in this way, because conservatives and fundamentalists are often inerrantists. And so they take very seriously the Bible, which I think is the way to do it. I'm a kind of an inerrantist in the same way that if you tell me your dream, I don't ask whether it happened or not, whatever is in your dream. I just go, it is an absolute representation of your desires and fears. So I take it absolutely seriously. And within the Bible, you do not have the classical metaphysical God that's impassible. You have a God who gets angry and frustrated and changes God's mind and regrets things. And so you actually have a very changeable God. And because the fundamentalist really embraces the literality of the Bible, they don't think that's a mistake. And they don't think that is a kind of a poetic license. They go like, if God says, I regret something, God regretted it. There's no poetic dimension to that. It's not, oh, God's pretending or God's lying to us. God really did it. So I actually find that conservatives and fundamentalists actually embrace this idea much more than progressives, who then take the Bible as a poetic thing and therefore tend towards a more impassible notion of God. And then within evangelicalism, and a lot of evangelicals don't accept this, but you have the movement of open theism. And open theism is a form of process theology that is palatable to evangelicals. And it was a Weyerhammer who is one of the major people in open theology is basically the idea that God is open to the future and does not know everything. and all of that. So I actually go like, I actually think conservatives and fundamentalists sometimes actually can grasp this much better than liberals.
It's funny because when I had to do an ordination paper to become ordained in the United Church of Christ, and I was working with some advisors on critiquing my ordination paper, and I said something in my paper to that effect of like, well, what if maybe God doesn't know the final outcome of how things are going to turn out? And my advisor was, don't say that. Yeah. Don't say that.
That's it. I think whereas for a conservative finds it can find themselves in a conflict. And by the way, as you know, I love the contradiction. So they can find themselves in a contradiction because in the Bible they are confronted, and fundamentalists read their Bibles obviously a lot more than progressives, and they're daily confronted with God not knowing everything, being confused and kind of like not hearing something or not seeing something, or as I said, regretting something. And they, because of the literalism, they then kind of, in a sense, bite the bullet more than a progressive who can go, oh, the Bible is a nice poetic kind of like thing, but ultimately, even like the ultimate progressive move is that even the crucifixion is a kind of play. That God doesn't really experience the loss of God, the absolute. Hegel calls it where substance becomes subject, but where the absolute experience is a lack within the absolute. The progressive goes, oh no, it was just for us. All Jesus was doing was quoting a psalm. It's poetic. It's and give me a conservative any day. I think conservatives are much more theological than liberals. I just think they haven't pushed it far enough. So.
Well, I mean, I do admire that, like, for them, it's so passionate. It's so much more like kind of all-consuming. There's a dedication to a certain way of life and a certain set of values. And I feel like, in a way, it's hard to find that outside of conservative fundamentalism,
100%. Here, give me conservatives over conservatives. I can help become forces for good much more easily than I can progressives. Anyway, that's in my work. Whenever I was doing practical work in Ireland, I always find it easier. I find the conservatives loved it because they had so much passion and so much drive, and actually whenever I told them that it's not that they take their faith too seriously, but they don't take it seriously enough, and I wanted to help them take it even more seriously, they love that kind of stuff, so they responded to it. Whereas liberals, often they sit at the back of the bar drinking a beer going, oh, come on, impress me with some fancy philosophy. And I like that.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, so I mean, I don't know if this is what you're saying, but it sounds like kenosis, because when I think of the lack, I think of the rupture, I think of kenosis, and it's this self-emptying of God, the nature of God, to give oneself away. How does that translate? I mean, you're saying a community should organize around the lack, around a concept of ambiguity and incompleteness, and the conservatives actually tend to do that more, perhaps, than progressives who maybe feel. I mean, I don't know. I definitely think both sides get into this idea of having the right answer.
Yeah. I mean, here's what. But you're exactly right. Like, this is why I say that whenever I mention the conservatives, I say to them, it's not that they take their faith too seriously, which is what the progressives say. And that will never work with a young conservative who wants to die for their faith, going like, the response of the conservative is, you think I'm taking it too seriously? I want to take it more seriously. But when you turn around and say, you're not taking it seriously enough, suddenly they're like, well, what do you mean by that? And what I mean by that is that exactly what you mentioned there, which is that, and what was it you mentioned there? Because you actually said it, and I can't believe I forgot it, is that, what did you just mention about conservatives?
They both.
The conservatives take more seriously the lack. That's what you said. And so whenever I say they don't take it seriously enough, I go, the problem is they balk at the last moment. They then go towards original blessing. So they actually go towards someone like Matthew Fox. Not that they admit it, they would balk at the idea, but that they at the very last hurdle, the conservative stops. They don't take the lack seriously enough. They don't redouble it, and that's what I mean by redoubled kenosis. And whereas the liberals, I don't think even get that far. You know, the liberals are right here. The conservatives go further with the lack. But the trick is to go to the next level with the lack. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So you're saying you're with regards to like Matthew Fox and Original Blessing, you brought that up. So you would contrast against that, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely, But although the funny thing is, the most radical move in Christianity in the West, at least in the UK and Europe, was called alternative worship back in the 90s, and there was a place called Nos, and Nos 9 o'clock service was influenced by Matthew Fox, and they did some fascinating stuff. Now, they totally imploded, and I think they imploded precisely because of these issues, but they were doing some very innovative stuff. But yeah, my issue is actually that Matthew Fox he exposes the all confessional Christianity. Ultimately, although Matthew Fox is seen as a kind of kind of new age, kind of whatever, I think the idea of original blessing is actually hard baked into most confessional Christianity. Even conservatives embrace original blessing, which means they don't embrace original sin. I think only when it comes to Hegel does original sin actually take on its true form.
So you're like kind of the ultimate conservative.
Huh? Oh yeah, in this way I'm a hyper conservative. Totally. I think. Well, see, this is where radical theology is a redoubling of fundamentalism. That's why most of the people who follow my work are the people who went so deep into their Christianity, like they sold everything they had, they destroyed their record collections, they fasted, they prayed, they did everything. And it's because those people who redouble, who go so deep into the tradition, directly encounter its contradictions and its deadlocks, and then move into something new. So for me, I'm a redoubled fundamentalist in a sense of going like, you've got to go so seriously into it. But when you go so seriously into it, you get to a post-theistic kind of place where salvation becomes salvation from salvation. But you can only get there by taking it really seriously. It's not you can only get there. You can get there by not doing that. But the ones who get there, it's almost like in the Bible it says, those who have been forgiven much love much, right? It's always like those who go right deep into the craziness, like almost psychotic belief, are the ones who can penetrate to the greener pastures on the other side. That sounds counterintuitive, but that's dialectics. Dialectics is extremes. And dialectics always chooses the wrong. Whenever you're given two positions, you always choose the wrong position. And that leads to the right position. That's a simplification of dialectics, but there is kind of truth whenever you're presented with two positions. I'm trying to think of a good example of that dialectic. Well, if you go to psychoanalysis and you've got the position of, don't look at your darkness, kind of run towards the light, or go into the deepest darkness and go into your suffering. Of course, everybody goes, the right decision is don't go into the darkness, right? But you actually choose the wrong. You go deeply into the wrong, and the wrong leads you to the right. So that's just an example of how this dialectic works in practice.
Well, that kind of sounds a little bit like the balance thing,
No, it's
a little bit.
Utterly. That's the deepening of the contradiction. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to draw me in. But what you should do, you should just edit that out. You should, at that moment, you should say, this sounds like balance, and then cut me off, and then put on my accent. Get someone who can do an Irish accent to go, yes, I fully agree. And then you go, well, everybody, that's the end of the second part of the podcast. Peter's fully agreed. Thank you very much. So there you go. That's a tip. That's a pro tip for you.
Right. No, really. I mean, oh gosh, some of this stuff is really, it's just so hard to wrap your mind around all of it. I mean, from what I can gather, I'm not really sure, honestly, if this is fully what you're saying or not, but if I can come to terms with the lack in myself, the imperfection in myself, the unconscious in myself, and recognize that other people are going through that too, and not fear it in myself, and therefore not fear in others. Because what I'm trying to do is tie this back into the question of how does this help me love my neighbor, right? That I can, once again, if I'm not scapegoating, then you're more than halfway to being a decent Christian, right? It's like,
well, that's it.
If you're not,
that's what I mean by the specific notion of love, because love is a universal. We're talking about specifically, what's this Christian notion of love? And I'll say it very simply, right? Original sin means original lack, right? So an ontological lack. And we've talked about that. So I'm saying that there is an original lack that's within reality. So that's what I mean by original sin. That's the ontological dimension. The ontic dimension is sin. Ontic means beings. So sin is anything you do to try to fill that lack. So sin doesn't mean being bad. Sin's nothing to do with a moral category, right? Sin is rather any activity, whether it's having kids, taking drugs, working hard, doing charity work, anything that tries to fill the lack. Then the moral dimension of sin is that when you try to do that, you frantically pursue things that will fix you, and you can't, so you will start to feel anxious and feel despair. 2, you will start to fantasize that they're what's called non-castrated others who have what you don't have, who don't have the lack, and you'll hate them for it, and you'll want to destroy them because they have what you don't have. And 3, you will pretend to be filled so as to get the pleasure of people believing that you've got rid of the lack. I.e., you'll pretend you have the perfect family, you'll pretend you have the perfect job. Instagram is the example of that, where you don't have the perfect life, but you get a pleasure from pretending you have a perfect life, right? So that's the moral dimension of sin. So we have the ontological dimension of sin, we have the ontic dimension of sin, and we have the ethical dimension of sin. Now, when the Bible talks about the forgiveness of sin, and that is very different from the payment of sin, right? So lack is a debt, right? If we think of lack, there's a difference between nothing and nothing. If I have no money, I have no money. But if I have debts, that lack of money is worse, right? It connects me with jobs I despise. I have to try and pay it back. I give myself a heart attack, right? So debt is the nothingness that we're talking about. And when the Bible talks about forgiving debt, when you forgive a debt, you don't pay it. So if you imagine, if you owe me $1,000 and I get someone else pays it, they fill that lack with money. They give me the money and the debt is paid. But if I forgive a debt, I don't get any money. I don't get paid. What I do is I render the nothingness nothing. I go, the nothingness that is something is now nothing. In other words, so I take the sting out of the nothingness. Now, the year of Jubilee was not the payment of debt, it was the forgiveness of debt. So when the Bible talks about the forgiveness of debt, it doesn't mean that you fill the lack. It means that you rob the lack of its lack. You rob the nothingness of its sting of nothingness. So, and it's basically, if you think of bankruptcy, the bankruptcy is a type of forgiveness, is the only thing we've got here. But whenever you owe money, it's not the owing money that causes anxiety. It's the phone calls. It's the people coming round to your door demanding, right? That's the devil, right? So you have in the Old Testament, you have the devil is the voice that says, if you eat the fruit, you'll be perfect. It's the voice that says you have to fill the lack. Eat the fruit, it'll give you knowledge. It will make you like God who traditionally who lacks the lack. And the notion is forgiveness of debt gets rid of the voice that demands that you have to fill the lack. That, for me, is Christianity. And why that's connected to love is when you no longer lack, when you lack the lack, when you're able to embrace that nothingness, you don't have to frenetically pursue a car or a partner or a person to make you fixed. And also you don't fantasize that other people have it, which is all Hollywood movies. The baddies are the ones who are having excessive pleasure that we want to kill. And you don't have to pretend that you have the thing in order to be happy. You can find contentness in not having. You can basically enjoy your lack of enjoyment. And that's what joy is. Joy is, in a sense, the pleasure that you get from not having. Even C.S. Lewis understood that. So there you go. Bam.
No, that was beautiful in a way. It's like I feel like that kind of hits the point home in terms of when you were talking about the difference between making the negative something substantial and
Yes.
making it nothing, right?
Oh,
The
that's
debt
very
is
good.
that's a good
Yes, that's
analogy.
very good, man. I'm glad that's very clever. You brought it back because that was the thing you said in the email you wanted to talk about, and that's where we've ended up is going. This is what I mean by not making the lack substantive. That actually
Right,
Christianity is desubstantializing the lack, and that's what forgiveness
right.
of debt means. Forgiveness of sin.
And that's one thing like Watts tried to highlight too is nothingness. That really nothingness, you need to have nothingness in order to have nothingness is the nothingness that contains the whole universe. You cannot have something without nothing,
Mhm.
right? Nothingness is necessary to contain the whole cosmos, and nothingness manifests. All the physical things
Yeah.
that are in the universe, right?
Well, I can tell. I already know what your project is going to be. I obviously it becomes obvious in this is that you're going to do something interesting about exploring how this thought and what's come together and don't come together. Because I can see that that is a question that you are really interested in exploring. I wonder if that's almost a question that will unfold gradually in the history of this podcast. That
Mm,
that actually maybe because we talked about the podcast and podcasts have to have a unique selling point, but they also have to, sometimes a journey in themselves. And my guess is if I was a betting man, I'd be betting that this journey of your podcast is going to be an interesting dialogue between radical theology and the kind of did Watts have a name for? Did he just call it Buddhism, or did he call it Zen, or did he have a particular name that he called the philosophy he was exploring? He may have just called it
um,
Buddhism or perennial philosophy. I don't know.
well, I don't know if he really called it anything specific. Once again, I think he was just very fascinated with, as I am. I think Watts's whole journey was about exploring what are the connections and the ways in which East and West overlap,
Mm.
the tradition of Christianity with, because Watts was an ordained Episcopal priest
Mm.
at one point in his life, with how does that connect or overlap with Eastern religious traditions like Hinduism, Taoism,
See, that's the
Buddhism,
thing. The
Zen?
Episcopals, my goodness, and I've got some Episcopal friends, but they are the most progressive of the lot, So yeah, I can
Mm.
understand actually progressives love ecumenism and Buddhism. Now, I am interested in Buddhism to some extent. I think one of the most interesting Christian thinkers on Buddhism was Thomas Altizer, but because he explored the elements in Oriental religions that connect with this radical gap. So I do think that you'll find it in interesting places. But by the way, what you're going to make me do is I'm going to watch some Watts. I'm going to engage some Watts, and probably once I've done enough research, I'll do a couple of talks on my kind of like interaction with Watts. So I promise I'll do that.
I feel like he was a genius in terms of a communicator.
Yeah,
He just, he's pleasant to listen to with his accent, and just the way he spoke was very
very likable
articulate,
guy,
and he had a
charismatic.
talent.
Yeah, he
Yeah.
has. Yeah, that's the thing I know about Watts is he was charismatic, intelligent, likable, and thoughtful and kind. That doesn't
And
mean
very
he's right.
flawed
Yes,
as well.
all right,
He,
sir.
I mean, he had an issue with alcoholism. I read his biography. He was a bit of an alcoholic, and did some things that I would condemn, even, just kind of in his own family life and those kind of things. But nevertheless, I feel like in his own way, he was a brilliant man, extremely articulate, and really made an impact on me. And I do think that that's been one of the themes of my own intellectual life and spiritual life is, how do I reconcile, or what's this dialogue between Eastern religious traditions and what I understand of Christianity, my own heritage.
By the
So,
way, I don't know about the bad side of Watson. We all have our issues. However, one of my arguments is that the more you embrace balance and oneness, the more you will repress the destructive and violent death drive urges, and then the more that they will come out in unhealthy ways. That actually, the more you can embrace, because this is the philosophy of my philosophy, and at its heart is that actually, if you can embrace that negative, they will still come out. Your angers, your violence, your frustrations, all of that, your fantasies, but they can come out in actually much healthier ways. Now, I'm not saying I don't want to say that that's the issue with what I don't know at all, but I have seen it that my concern is the more one seeks the oneness, the more you will find often very broken families, drugs, alcohol, sexual stuff. And I say it's not that you can get away with it. That's the point of paratheology. You can't get away with it. What you can simply do is find more productive ways to make space for those dimensions of yourself, because we all have them. So, it's like when people ask, what are your pastimes? You go like, well, do you want me to tell you what I fantasizing about? What I like, I'm either going to tell you what's boring and not true, or, we all have violent fantasies and desires and politically incorrect things that are going on. And the more we deny them, we completely repress them, the more they come out in terrible, violent ways. So, but none of us are free from the craziness. By the way, I'm noticing that I've got darker and darker. If anybody, people can't see this, but if they saw it, they would think I was the devil, because all you can see is my face in pure blackness.
Yeah, you need to turn on a light over there.
I know. I think it looks quite
create
cool.
some balance.
Yeah. I like this look. My goodness.
Yeah, no, it's good. Oh gosh.
Man. Well, I really enjoyed that. Is there anything else you want to finish up on or sum up?
Oh gosh. Yeah. Well, like last time, I think we could probably go on forever if we could. But no, I think it was a great conversation. I think it's like, I mean, there's no end to it. It's fascinating, and it'll be interesting to see where things go from here.
Yeah.
And
I just want to say that I do love the fact that this clarifying podcast actually just redoubled the complexity, and I think that's just a beautiful example of what I'm talking about. That's what I want to say.
Right. Hopefully none of my future congregants or whatever that are listening to it are going to condemn me as a heretic, but
I'll take that. I'll be the scapegoat for that happily.
Yeah. No, it was a lot of fun. Thanks again.
Cool, man.
For doing this, being with us here. So yeah, it was great. I really enjoyed it.
Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.